You would think that a man like George Patton died in battle. He did not. The most aggressive general America had in the entire war, the one who was always at the front, always under fire, always daring the enemy to kill him, survived every campaign, every close call, without a fatal wound. And then months after the war was over, when there was no enemy left to face, he was killed by a slow-speed car accident so minor that nobody else involved was even badly hurt. If that already sounds strange to you, you are not alone, because a great many people have looked at those facts and refused to believe it was an accident at all. Some are convinced Patton was murdered. So let us do this honestly and look at what actually happened, and at whether the most famous suspicion of his death holds up. First, the man, because the shock of his death only makes sense against the size of his life. George S. Patton was the great attacking general of the American War, a profane, brilliant, larger-than-life figure with his ivory-gripped revolvers and his gift for speed and violence, who drove his Third Army across North Africa, through Sicily, across France after D-Day, and into Germany, faster and harder than almost anyone thought possible. He courted danger constantly, exposed himself at the front again and again, and became, to his own men and to the enemy, a kind of force of nature. If any general of that war seemed destined to die spectacularly in combat, it was Patton. But he didn't die in combat, and that is the first strange thing. He came through the entire war alive, and when Germany surrendered in May 1945, Patton, at the height of his fame, found himself in the one situation he had no idea how to survive: peace. There was no more fighting to do, no more front to be at, and a warrior built entirely for battle was suddenly a man without a war. And in that peace, cut loose from the fighting that had defined him, he quickly became a very different kind of problem. Patton could not keep quiet. In the months after the war, he made a series of outspoken, controversial remarks, clashing with his superiors over how occupied Germany should be run, and most dangerously for his reputation, growing loudly, bitterly distrustful of the Soviet Union, America's wartime ally, arguing that the West had beaten the wrong enemy. It made him a headache to his own government and got him removed from command of his beloved Third Army. And it is exactly this, his late-war turn into a loose anti-Soviet cannon, that would later fuel the belief that someone wanted him gone. On December 9, 1945, General Patton got into his car to go pheasant hunting. It is all documented from here. One quick thing before we go on, then straight back to that December morning. If these stories are worth your time, a subscribe genuinely helps the channel keep making them. Thank you. Now, the accident itself. What happened next was almost absurdly ordinary. Patton's Cadillac, moving at low speed on a road near Mannheim, collided with an American Army truck that turned across its path. It was a minor crash. The vehicles were barely damaged in the way that kills people, and everyone else, the drivers, the other passenger, walked away essentially unhurt. But Patton, in the back seat, was thrown violently forward and struck his head on the metal frame inside the car, and the impact broke his neck. In an instant, the general who had survived years of shot and shell was paralyzed from the neck, down gravely injured by a fender bender on a quiet road in a country already at peace. He was rushed to a hospital in Heidelberg, and for 12 days he lay there, paralyzed, fading, the world's newspapers following every update. The doctors did what they could. Patton, characteristically, faced it with grim clarity, understanding better than anyone what his condition meant. And on December 21, 1945, General George S. Patton died of complications from his injuries at the age of 60. The greatest attacking soldier of the American war had been killed, in the end, not by the enemy, but by a car accident in peacetime. And it was the sheer wrongness of that, the mismatch between the man and the manner of his death, that would launch a mystery still argued over today. Here is the theory, and it has been made in books and documentaries for decades. It holds that Patton's death was no accident, but an assassination arranged to silence a dangerous man. The argument goes like this. By late 1945, Patton had become a serious political liability, loudly anti-Soviet, contemptuous of the post-war settlement, hinting that he might resign and go public with everything he thought was wrong. at a moment when keeping the alliance with Stalin intact still mattered enormously. To the people who believe he was killed, that made him a threat worth removing, and they point to alleged confessions, most famously the later claims of a former intelligence operative who said he had been involved in staging the crash, and to the argument that a paralyzed but stable Patton was somehow finished off in the hospital. In this telling, the convenient timing and the strangeness of the accident are not coincidence. They are the fingerprints of a cover-up. And here is the honest problem with it. There is no proof. The dramatic confessions are uncorroborated and come from unreliable sources. No hard evidence of a staged crash or a hospital killing has ever surfaced. And the plain facts fit an accident at least as well as a plot. Minor crashes do sometimes break necks, especially in the heavy steel cars of that era with no seatbelts. A broken neck in a 60-year-old man really can lead to fatal complications in days, and the who-benefited logic on its own proves nothing. Most serious historians conclude that Patton died exactly the way the record says, in a genuine accident and its aftermath. The assassination story endures not because the evidence is strong, but because the alternative, that a titan was undone by something so small and so stupid, is so hard for people to accept. Which points at the real reason we still tell this story. It is worth being clear-eyed about why theories like this take hold, because Patton's is a textbook case. A famous, powerful man dies suddenly and strangely at a politically convenient moment, and the human mind recoils from the idea that something so large could turn on something so random. We want big deaths to have big causes. An assassination, however sinister, at least makes the world feel orderly, as if a man like Patton could only be brought down by a deliberate hand. The truth that a wet road, a turning truck and a few feet of steel could end the same man the German army never managed to kill is somehow harder to bear. That discomfort is real, and it is exactly the soil these stories grow in, whether or not there is anything underneath them. Patton himself had said, more than once, that the way for an old soldier to die was to be killed by the last bullet of the last battle of the last war. He got almost the cruelest opposite. He survived every battle, every bullet, every war he was given, and then died slowly in a hospital bed from an accident that would have been a footnote for anyone else. There is a bitter irony in it that he, of all people, would have hated, and it is that irony, more than any secret plot, that makes his death feel like it must mean something more than it does. So that is the true story, as honestly as it can be told. General George Patton, the fearless, unkillable warrior of the American War, was most likely killed by nothing more than a low-speed car crash and a broken neck, a random, meaningless piece of bad luck that no enemy and no plot could have engineered. The assassination theory is possible, and it is unproven, and after all these years it remains far more suspicion than evidence. But the reason people cannot let it go is understandable, because a man that large should not be able to die that small. He was buried, at his own wish, among the soldiers of his Third Army, in a military cemetery in Luxembourg, one grave among thousands, exactly as he wanted. The general who could not be killed in battle lies there still. And whether his death was a plot or just an accident, the argument over it has kept his name alive, which is perhaps the only ending George Patton would have found acceptable. In the end, the two Pattons sit side by side and refuse to merge. The invincible warrior of the newsreels and the 60-year-old man dying quietly of a broken neck in a hospital bed a week before Christmas. Both are real. He was the general who seemed too fierce to die, and he was also always just a man, as mortal as the thousands of his own soldiers he had led and buried. Perhaps that is the quietest truth in the whole story. The thing that makes his death feel impossible, that a titan could fall to an accident, is the same thing that made him human all along. Legends do not die in car crashes. Men do. And for all the fire and the legend, George Patton was, at the last, a man.